Hello, everybody. Thank you to everyone for dialing in. My name is Dan Waldron. I'd like to kick off this CGAP FIBR webinar. So for the last year and a half, we've had the pleasure of working on research into the consumer value of PAYGo solar, and this presentation summarizes that work, which was done jointly by CGAP and by FIBR. Most of the people dialing in probably know CGAP, but we are the consultative group to assist the poor, a partnership of 34 organizations dedicated to advancing financial inclusion. And our collaborator in this work, FIBR, or Financial Inclusion on Business Runways, is an initiative of the consulting firm BFA in partnership with MasterCard Foundation that investigates business-driven approaches to financial inclusion. So on the panel today, we have myself, Dan Waldron, and I head up the research at CGAP within the Digital Finance Plus initiative, looking into how financial inclusion can impact access to energy and water. Julie Zollman was the lead researcher into PAYGo consumer insights for this project, and she works both independently and with BFA to understand the demand side of retail financial services. Paul Warner is on the call as the head of customer and market intelligence at Off Grid Electric, which is a PAYGo solar provider operating both in East and West Africa. And last but certainly not least, Yasmin bin Humam is a financial sector specialist at CGAP, focusing on gender issues, and she facilitates a community of practice on women's financial inclusion. So they'll all be speaking quite a bit after I go through the initial presentation. So just to go through the agenda for today, just after the introductions, I'll be going through about a 15-minute presentation on the context for this research, what we heard, so the sort of higher-level takeaways. We'll then be opening things up for the panel to weigh in on their impressions, what they agreed with, maybe what they didn't agree with, and then we'll open things up to the wider audience of participants. And this is the reminder that you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the entire presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. There's a chat box on the lower right-hand corner of the WebEx, and be sure to send your comments to all participants, which is the last option. If you open up the drop-down menu, is the very bottom option. So we'll be reading them throughout, and we will address as many as we can during the Q&A portion. Obviously, we probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So without further ado, let's get into it. Throughout this research and throughout this presentation, we thought it was extremely important that people hear not just our summary as researchers of what we heard, but what was actually said by respondents. And so if you read the paper and if you look throughout this presentation, you're going to see a lot of quotes like this one. And I think this is a good indicator of the general opinion that we heard from respondents. Why did we get into this research? Well, in the few years that I've been working in the pay-as-you-go sector, most conversations around affordability of these products have emphasized their net savings. The idea is that PAYGo customers are next day richer because they reduce their energy expenditure and/or they generate income using solar. And this was based on a lot of work that had been done by SolarAid and Sunny Money and others, which showed that when you swap a kerosene lamp for a solar lantern, the latter pays for itself in reduced expenditure and energy, often quite quickly. But lanterns are quite cheap, and solar home systems are not. And evidence from Kenya brought out by FSDK indicated the story might be a little bit more complicated. So in the 300 households within their Kenyan Financial Diaries research, the median household was only spending $2.50 on energy. And yet several had adopted PAYGo solar, which is at least three times or if not more expensive. So we had these questions that were gnawing at us, and we wanted to get some answers from the customers themselves. And we launched this research with a few of those clear questions in mind. How did people decide to acquire PAYGo solar? And I'll explain what we mean by that term in a second for anyone who doesn't know. How were they able to afford it? And what, if anything, kept them from paying? So those are the motivating questions behind the research. We interviewed 138 rural households in Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. So that's 40 each in Kenya, Tanzania, and Cote d'Ivoire, where we had 2 different providers we worked with in each market, and just 20 in Ghana, where we only worked with 1 provider. The big caveat here is that we deliberately oversampled for low-income households and/or households that were struggling to pay. And the reason for that was that we wanted to see how far down market this product could go. What are the outer bounds of affordability? Our sample was not representative of broader portfolios, and that's why throughout this presentation and the paper, you're not going to see me or anyone else say 68% of respondents said this or 48% were able to afford that. The idea is more to capture general trends and impressions, and I think we were able to do that. And the only reason we were able to was thanks to the 4 providers who worked quite hard with us throughout this research, letting us connect with their customers, and interview them unsupervised. And it should go without saying that the opinions I'm about to express are those of the researchers and the analysts who worked on this project and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the providers. That's why we have Paul here to hear from him later, speaking on behalf of all PAYGo solar providers. So getting into the results, and now just pausing to a brief caveat here, pay-as-you-go solar, for anyone who doesn't know, is a way of providing consumer finance for solar home systems in which a user is able to pay for the system over time and where payment is linked to usage. So if someone is not able to pay on a Monday, they simply can't use their solar home system, but if they resume payment on Tuesday, they're able to use it right away without having to clear arrears. And CGAP has certainly written much more on the topic. If you want more of an intro, I can absolutely direct you to our research there. So what do we hear in the field? The first and the greatest insight is that customers were overwhelmingly satisfied with their purchase. It gave them a strong sense of pride, of dignity, and achievement, and that people acquired PAYGo because they were tired of being in the dark. And that darkness can be both literal and figurative. Literally, people want light, right? They want light for security or for studying or just because it's evidence of how far they've come in their own economic development. Figuratively, people value radios and televisions that they're able to use through pay-as-you-go solar because it provides them a window to a larger world. And they know it's out there, but they are often unable to access it. They want the access to that information, and PAYGo gives them that. And that's it, as the customer says. So from a customer's perspective, the single greatest feature of PAYGo is that it allows them to pay in installments, right? That's not often the first thing we talk about. We sort of take that for granted, but that is the biggest selling point. Historically, these customers have not been able to access financing for these kinds of lifestyle purchases, and that prevented them from accessing many goods that they would have otherwise wanted. They're grateful for the trust that providers showed in them, and they're extremely grateful for the respect with which providers conducted transactions and interactions with them. They really felt that this trust had been placed in them, and they valued that relationship, which, as we'll talk later, is a real key to this business model. And I realize that sounds somewhat cold and calculating, but it's also just key from any sort of customer-centric service model. They need to be placed at the center of this. So to get to the reality of affordability, and the key question, how are people able to afford this? We had respondents walk us through their energy expenditure both pre and post acquiring PAYGo. Many of them initially responded that yes, they were saving money. But when we asked them to itemize prior and current expenditures, most, not all but most, were now spending more since they had acquired pay-as-you-go solar. When they were saving, it was generally due to a stretched loan term, so more of a 2 or 3 year term, which I'll discuss more later. And few households were using their systems to generate income. I should say, our model shows us that many more users would save money over the lifetime of the product. So if it lasts 5 years, they'll save money overall on their energy expenditure. But within the lifetime of the loan, their energy expenditure had increased since acquiring PAYGo. However, although that is true, right, people are spending more on energy, it was still a manageable piece of their income. Customers were not always sure how they increased their energy expenditure, but some told us they had cut back on other categories of spend. They had sold livestock or used savings group payouts, or because they can do this with pay-as-you-go, they went without solar on occasion if they were unable to make a payment. And this is broadly consistent with what we see elsewhere. First, customers do not acquire solar to save money, as Ackland and others shows in India. That ranks very, very far down the list of reasons to acquire. But we also know that when you move up the energy ladder, your expenditure on energy increases. And this is, I think, intuitive, right? All of us spend more than these customers do on energy, and at some point, increased levels of service cost more. But customers often see the value there, and that's why they make the decision to acquire, because they're purchasing a higher quality level of service. So if they're able to afford it, they want it. And this is incredibly important for how we think about energy financing and how we do credit assessment. It is likely that a large portion of these loans do not pay for themselves. That's what our research shows. That's what other research emerging from Schatz Energy Center shows. Does that mean we shouldn't give out those loans? No, absolutely not. But it does mean that we cannot rely on that assumption when we're assessing creditworthiness. And that over-indebtedness could be a real issue within this sector. So the last two results I'd like to highlight before I turn things over to the panel are sort of rumbles in the distance, right? These were not, we didn't hear this from every household, but we heard it from enough households, from multiple respondents, It checked out when we talked with providers, and we think these could represent serious issues in the not too distant future. The first is around gender, as you can see from the quote. In every market we looked at with two-parent households, it was the man who made the decision to acquire solar. Women resisted, usually because they were worried about the financial burden. Now, most of the women we talked to were quite happy with the product after they've lived with it for some period of time, but they had been opposed initially, and perhaps with good reason, because in at least some of the cases, we were told that households were able to afford solar by cutting back on women's budgets. Now, there are obviously larger socioeconomic forces here, but if recurrent PAYGo financing is going to be a large and growing sector of an economy, these households are going to take on more and more loans, and we can't ignore the effect that may be having on people who aren't making those borrowing decisions. We'll definitely discuss this more with our panel in a minute. The other rumble in the distance is around consumer protection. So this is never easy, particularly dealing with this customer base, right? So rural, off-grid, often illiterate. But we ran into far too many cases where customers did not understand the terms of the contract that they were showing us, and or where agents had misrepresented the terms in that contract. In general, I will say that the more complicated the offering, the worse we saw customers understand it. And one very simple fix that some providers have already adopted is to just constantly be updating customers on their remaining loan balance, because a surprising number of customers could not tell us how many payments they had left or how long until they were going to own their unit. So getting into the higher level takeaways, once you sort of look at this whole picture together, there's a real question around loan tenor within this space, and an inherent tension between wanting to keep loan tenor short, but also wanting to reach the people that need pay-as-you-go the most, who could benefit from a longer tenor. And while we won't pretend like it's an easy decision, our experience in this research definitely left us in favor of keeping loan tenors as short as possible. So just to compare them a little bit, with longer loans, you're able to keep the daily or monthly cost of energy low. It makes it more affordable. And you can give somebody a larger system right at the start. So you can offer a fairly poor household a television and let them pay it off over 3 years or even more in some cases. But on the downside, repayment rates of any given cohort are going to be deteriorating over every month of that loan. And now you have to go and raise capital for 2 to 3 years, and that is much more expensive money. As well as the falling cost of solar is going to make competitors' products much more attractive in the last year of that deal. So suddenly, this product, which looked great 2 years ago, is now obsolete. There's something else on the market, and there may not be something that really ties this customer to this provider. So to whatever extent possible, you want to keep the costs as low as you can so that you can keep loan tenor short. And then the big question, right? Who are we reaching? Are we able to make this a product and a service model that works for the entire off-grid market? Just based on our research, it is possible to reach 75 to 80% of the addressable market, but we're not doing that right now, and there's not a quick fix that will let us get there. Providers need to be strategic, and providers that are going to reach that customer segment need to recognize that the value will almost certainly not come out of the first loan, right? They are building something for the long term, and to do that, you have to be kind to people, and you cannot lie to them. Over the last years, I've had the pleasure of interviewing dozens of pay-as-you-go customers. Julie has interviewed more than I have, and Paul probably more still. I personally am always struck by the loyalty of those people who feel that they have been treated right. They consider themselves part of a team with the provider who's given them the solar product. I am also struck by the bitterness and just the rage of those people who feel they've been cheated or patronized in any way. And so most of the customers we spoke to felt they had been treated with respect and dignity. And for these customers, quite frankly, that is rare with the providers they do interact with. So I would conclude just this presentation by saying to providers that you will have a customer for life if this is done right, but that you can poison the well if it is not. And just leaving on this last quote, which I think really sums up both, there are questions around affordability within the sector, but there is not a question around the value, at least to the people we spoke with. This was something they were happy they purchased and would recommend purchasing to others. So that concludes just the summary of the research, and I would certainly direct you to the paper as well, and we'll send out the link for that after the webinar. At this point, I'd like to loop in the actual experts in this space, and starting with Julie Zollman, who is the lead researcher for BFA on this project. Julie, before I sort of get into any questions, did this sort of broadly summarize what you saw in the field, and is there anything in particular you'd like to emphasize?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, this was a really fun project to work on. I think, as Dan was explaining, we were really curious about how families were making this kind of purchase work. It seemed like a really big stretch in some of the places where we've done lots of research already. And my colleague Ann Gashoka and I approached this work as we do with every other financial product or experience that we've studied, whether that be mobile money, savings groups, even gambling, to try to understand where's the value proposition coming in. And it was pretty early on that we recognized there was something special about what people were getting out of PAYGo Solar. These units were really important to people who didn't have access to electricity. It's not a replacement for grid, but the electricity grid is not going to reach many of these places and not going to reach them well for some time. And so when we saw how excited people were to have what they saw high-tech kind of piece of equipment in their house that solved a really deeply felt need, we just thought it was even more important that we figure out how to get this right and support companies that are bringing the service to people. I know that many people are disappointed to learn that solar doesn't always or even doesn't usually pay for itself, but I really wasn't. And as we sort of went through this work, it reminded me of a lot of times that we've seen just how valuable bringing a bit of comfort into people's lives can be, and potentially even beneficial in the long term. So when we look at, for example, Give Directly's work, where they give large cash grants to very poor families, one of the first things that people tend to buy is a mattress or some kind of housing improvement. And those things also don't return an immediate economic return, but they bring comfort, rest, dignity, security. That was a big thing for people when they would talk about lights. We found that in the US, there's been experiments where providing the homeless first with shelter helps everything else sort of fall into place, whether that's mental health care or getting a new job. They're much more successful at that. We lead with the comfort and the security of housing. So I think sort of some of those things come together. And when it comes to indebtedness, I think we always need to sort of keep our eye on that ball. But I think asset finance of this nature, even when it's not productive, can be extremely powerful. And that where I've seen really indebtedness problems come in, it's more a function of a market rather than a specific product. And we know that these things can get out of hand. If you take a look at South Africa or Brazil, where asset-based credit for things like appliances has sort of gone crazy or out of hand. When we talk to people who've just taken sort of one loan at a time, they will still tell these transformative stories about how a refrigerator or the ability to buy a washing machine has really changed their life. So I think we should be cautious, but this is definitely an area where we can bring really difficult to finance, to buy products in reach of people who really need them and can benefit from them.
Great. I mean, thank you, Julie, for covering those areas. Particularly, I think that the last one is a big question a lot of people are asking right now, and maybe we'll get into a little bit more in the discussion. Before I shift things over to Paul, I do just want to remind people, I don't think we're having too many questions coming in yet, so now is the time to send them in, because we'll be opening things up in about 15 minutes, and hope to have some, hopefully interesting questions to debate for our panel. Paul, thank you again for dialing in from Tanzania. I know it's getting a little bit late there, but we'd be really interested in just, first of all, getting your general takeaways from this research. Does it match with what you've seen? Is there anything here that you disagree with? And does this inform at all anything that Off-Grid Electric is going to be doing going forward?
Thank you, Dan. I hope everybody can hear me well since I'm dialing in from Tanzania. First of all, yes, thank you very much for this report. This was helpful to us. I think the sector changed a lot in the last few years. I mean, every year is a big change, of course, but we as a company changed a lot in the last year in our offerings and our model. And basically, this report confirms a lot of our thinking. For us, it shows, it illustrates that we're heading into the right direction as a company. I cannot speak for our competitors, but for us at Zola or Cote Electric, it means offering larger, more aspirational hardware to more affluent households that are less prone to risks, financial risks in their situation. We are a commercial company after all. We have investors that also want to receive a return on their investments. And this report also illustrates that, yeah, the bottom of the pyramid customers are high risk, and there's a large market still, more affluential households in Africa. The middle segment is growing enormously, so there's a lot to gain for us there. Furthermore, I think this report also illustrates that it's important for us internally to start the discussion around payment flexibility. There is a need for it. We haven't figured it out yet on how to do that best. So that's something we will have to work on. Ownership is emphasized. The credit screening with a higher deposit fee, that comes pretty clear from this report. So these are all initiatives that we have been doing in the last year and continue to work on. One thing that I do, however, have to disagree with the report is the reason why people get solar or solar home system. Bottom line, people have been living their lives for centuries, for decades, families without modern light. There is an alternative. There is kerosene, there are candles. And of course, we all know that these are not great alternatives. They're harmful in a lot of different views, but what is a game changer is a television. So a television, there is no conventional alternative to power a television. You can only power a television with electricity. And solar energy is a game changer there. I mean, when you are able to give people in a rural village a solar system that comes with a television, it's enormous. It's it's an escape of boredom. It's entertainment value. It really adds something different, something unique that there is no alternative substitute for. So I think the report talks a lot about lighting, and if you speak in the context of rural poverty, I mean, probably that's the angle to approach it from. But for us as a business, and what is really transformational to see also in the market is offering a television and more aspirational, affluential to affluent households, more aspirational hardware. So I think that's the one thing that I want to add to this discussion, to this presentation from our point of view.
Thank you, Paul. Julie, before I throw things over to Yasmin, what would your response be to that sort of last question, right, about the lighting sort of versus entertainment as being a primary driver? Was that true for everyone you spoke to as well, or is that just a sort of the next step up the ladder? How do you see that?
I think we really focused on the entry-level systems that were just about lights, phone charging, and radios. And what we saw was that there was a demand to acquire a television as long as they could get a signal in their area. Like, that's very aspirational, and I think many people want to get there, and they're not sure yet if they can maybe afford it. So we were looking at that lower-end market. But I would say that even the lights alone provide a kind of transformation that's really important to people, really valuable, and that's something about dignity. Yes, they can use candles, they can use kerosene, they can use little battery-operated things that are often handmade. There's a lot of creativity out there. But it feels in some ways undignified. And I think that's where a lot of the power of these systems comes from, is that people are trusted with a piece of technology that they didn't think was possible before. They feel like this is a piece of modernity, and they also feel like in a lot of these countries that they're the people who have been neglected. that they're not paid attention to, they're not treated well. And there's a company willing to both trust them and to, in many cases, just talk nicely to them for the first time. And that dignity that comes with that was really important to people. It made them feel really good. It made them even perhaps feel like they could aspire to having a television. So I think that's very powerful. But I would say that there's not only a market for the entertainment, the television going higher end, but to make the market work for a lower end, for bringing people in with even smaller entry-level systems can work, but it has to work thinking about the entire life of the customer and not as a one-time transaction. It really has to, you have to be able to spread that very expensive acquisition costs for bringing in low-income people in remote areas by definition, and keeping them as customers for some time.
Great. Well, I think we're definitely going to get more into the last issue you brought up, Julie, particularly about going down market and kind of circling back to the first thing Paul said. But before I do that, I'd like to bring in Yasmin and ask, so just starting from the basics, you read through this report. What were your initial impressions of this sector, particularly as relates to women's financial inclusion?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Paul and Julie, for your insights. And I see that there are questions pouring in, so I'll try to keep my remarks short for right now. I'm really glad that this report highlights the fact that we can't assume that men and women in a given household have the same spending priorities, and we can't assume that they value things in the same way. CGAP will soon be publishing a brief on findings from its smallholder financial diaries, which show that in Mozambique, women spend over 50% of their expenditures on groceries, and in Tanzania, it's 35%. And in Tanzania, the next highest expense for women is school fees, and these figures look very different for men. Both bring in higher incomes and have more volatile sort of net income flows. And so it's not surprising that men and women have different views on, the affordability of solar systems to the household. But we also found that women made just as many savings and credit transactions in a year as men, and that on average, the value of the savings transaction in each individual saving transaction was higher for women than for men. So, women rely very, very heavily on savings, but then those savings go out the door quite quickly for other things that they're responsible for. And I think that's one of the reasons why commitment savings products have been so popular with women and right. Protecting that money, whereas this credit model, it's a completely different model. The trade-offs are quite different. And the other thing that I'll mention quite briefly was because this point on, whether this solar is going towards productive means, whether it's paying for itself in essence. And I think this topic could be looked into a bit more nuanced, a bit more deeply, because even if you're not using it to generate an income, right? If you have high quality light in your home, it might allow you to do your sewing in the evening and spend more time in your fields during the day and be more productive, for example. It might allow you to get certain information via the radio or via your mobile phone that leads you to take certain decisions. And, Oxfam has really great tools for time use surveys among households. And I realize this probably isn't something that the PAYGo providers would do, but it's something that organizations like Oxfam, BFA, CGAP can look into to give a much more comprehensive picture on, the income dynamics that these products are having.
Paul, just your reaction. So how does Off-Grid Electric look at this question, right? Both of making sure that you're offering something that appeals to both men and women, but also making sure that you're not selling something to a husband whose wife may not believe that the household can financially, afford that product.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult question, Dan. That's not easy to answer. Well, what we do as a company, we are pretty diligent when it comes to making sure that the terms and conditions are clear around our loan agreement. We have a pretty strict script when we sell our customers in the field. There's an agreement with terms and conditions, and we call out again by our call center to actually validate with each customer that registered for our service if they want it, and do they understand the terms and conditions, or do they want to cancel the product that they just signed up for. On gender specific, we don't discriminate, differentiate in that ourselves. What we do see is that the men, as you also mentioned, often take, it's a very masculine societies here in Africa, men make the decisions on where the money is going to. We do see that the women and children are strong influencers in this, but for the rest, yeah, we don't do much around addressing the gender differences in our sales.
Okay, that's good to know. And then, yeah, obviously these problems exist. These are not unique to pay-as-you-go solar, certainly. So, and maybe to that point, Yasmin, how does the gender imbalance in this sector sort of relate to what you've seen across financial service models? Are we in extra trouble, or is this sort of par for the road?
Yeah, it's funny, Paul said we don't discriminate, and that may be true and many providers take this perspective. We don't discriminate between our clients. Anybody can sign up for our service. Right. But, I think there's increasing recognition that it's not enough, right? Women have different lived realities. They have different needs. You need to tailor the products and the terms for what they're going through. Many providers are experimenting with women agents who can reach perhaps women customers better, who have a different approach to the sales and the marketing of the products. And so it's about going beyond that. But many providers don't collect sex disaggregated data on their client base. I mean, Tavneet Suri, who's a researcher at MIT, who just over a year ago released a landmark study on how M-Pesa is helping to lift poor women-headed households out of poverty in Kenya, mentioned that M-Pesa doesn't collect sex disaggregated data on its client base and has no intention to. So it's, things are changing in this space. Organizations like Women's World Banking and the GSMA's Connected Women program are actively working with providers to start collecting this kind of data to properly segment their client markets and be able to target women better. There are anecdotes of products and services that have done a great job at reaching women and targeting them directly. UNCDF recently published findings from its Clean Start program in Nepal, which is about solar energy, and 94% of their customers were women. So, there are instances, but it's largely anecdotal, and data sets like the Global Findex, the Global FinScope surveys, Financial Inclusion Insights, these demand-side surveys all consistently show gender gaps in access to and usage of digital financial services.
Julie, you must have thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say that when we started hearing a little bit about some of these gender implications, I was really surprised. I would have expected that these products were really good for women. In fact, women spend a lot of money on home improvements, on small-scale sort of assets for the home. I would have thought it was very powerful, but I think there are often surprises. I know when we were doing a follow-up study to the Kenya Financial Diaries, I interviewed several women whose husbands had gotten formal jobs for the first time, and I thought they would be celebrating this. But actually, it was very difficult for them because it changed the construction of who is responsible for what kind of spending in the family, and shifted a lot of the day-to-day burdens like groceries onto women, whereas when their husbands were working in the informal sector, they were doing more of that day-to-day kind of thing. So I think that I don't think it's the responsibility of companies like Paul's to be thinking about necessarily inclusion and these social impacts all the time. They have to run a business. But as outsiders, I think we need to be really conscious and creative about possible solutions that are out there. And women are just going to be a really big growth market. In most places in Africa, women earn less than men. But it's not as if they're sitting at home and not earning any money. Women have incomes in many of these countries, and they're very active money managers. And so we need to be creative about how to bring them in, and not just because that's good for society, but because this is an important market. And the companies that invest in reaching women and stick with them are going to see huge benefits, because I don't think they're being reached very well. And I think that's one way that outsiders can really play a role in thinking about creative responses and how to really tailor services to bring women in the door and sort of deliver value over the life of the client.
Thank you, Julie. So I'm going to switch tacks a little bit and getting back to something that Paul brought up in his first question. It's the first thing he highlighted, and we've actually gotten a couple of questions, so I'm going to steal from the future slightly. From Agili Zored asking, do we think a profitable model exists by going down market instead of up market into aspirational products? And Paul, the way I take that question and just ask you is, you've identified this as the area you want to play, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? If that fits the products you have and the competencies in your organization. Is there a model, at least, for going down market with pay-as-you-go solar? Or is that something where you still need some level of, I don't know, subsidy or market support in that way?
Yes, I think the latter is true, that there is still some level of subsidy or assistance necessary to reach those people effectively and enable them as well to have access to this technology. So a little bit of history, and I will keep it short on where we are coming from as a company. So when we started 5 years ago, we introduced solar as a service. For 10,000 shilling, which is approximately $4.50 per month, you have a solar system with 5 lights and a phone charger and a radio. So incredibly affordable. We started with that model. We experimented for about 3 years, and yeah, the result of that we ended up with a customer base whereby only 35% paid on time and 70% didn't pay on time, and almost half of our customers churned. So that solar as a service for the bottom of the pyramid, which we piloted, which we experimented, which is how we started as a company, didn't work out for us. It costed us a lot of money. And so that was our motivation to make that shift more upmarket. I do think that the model of PAYGo, yeah, definitely, that it's a great model. It enables people with mobile money. People are comfortable with mobile money to make small payments. But to address that customer base, the bottom of the pyramid, enable them to get solar systems, yeah, that requires probably some form of subsidy or help, or yeah, that needs to be picked up by a company or social enterprise, NGO, that is not us at the moment.
No, I think that's fair. And then I was going to ask you about the sort of shift in your model from service to an asset, so I think that's a really helpful way of understanding it. Julie, to come back to the idea of this consumption versus productive loans, right? And, how does that affect how we should look at risk in this sector? Right? I mean, you talked about this, these are very common things that households want. Obviously, when they get money, they want to buy, you know, you said a bit of comfort, which I think is a great phrase. And that's completely understandable. But how then can a provider assess their ability and willingness to repay? And are we doing that sufficiently well in the PAYGo sector right now?
So let me just also add on to Paul's comments there real quick, is that
Sure.
each of the markets that we looked at was very, very different. So in Kenya, for example, you have very few relatively rich people that are not already connected to the grid. Getting connected to the grid was, if you had the money, you could do it, even though it was extremely expensive. And so the only market there that's not on the grid is going to be quite low income. Whereas in West Africa, where we have a lot of cash crop farmers, we saw a very different pattern where there were a number of relatively wealthy people far from the grid who actually in Cote d'Ivoire, many people were buying PAYGo solar as a replacement to other forms of solar that they had already purchased. So whether there's even a big market of the higher end users in a country is really up for, examination. It's not automatic. Then in terms of whether or not assets are productive and what that means, I think what we did also see is that in the early adopters in every community were able to use their solar devices for the most part to charge other people's cell phones and earn some money off of that. But as soon as several people in the community had solar, that was no longer an option. So when we think about delivering sort of financed productive assets, we need to keep that in mind. The research that we've done in Kenya on people's small enterprises has shown us that market size is often a more important determinant of growth than access to capital. So we can't flood every community with a sewing machine or even with a cow and change milk prices. Those things all really matter. And so having a business that does productive asset financing at scale has to be really, really thoughtfully done. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. When it comes to consumption credit and where the risks really come in, and work that I've done with FSD Africa on credit markets, and a report that if those are interested can Google, it's called Credit on the Cusp. What we found was that consumption credit becomes risky when there are lots of layers, when it's based upon incomes in the future that are very uncertain. And so I think the idea of giving people access to credit that's really one at a time kind of thing isn't necessarily too risky. And starting with an entry-level product and moving up is a pretty viable option. But providers do need to keep in mind that people's incomes do not grow as quickly as your willingness to lend to them. And they might still be paying back on something, a very large loan, that's really a strain because your good payers, they are committed to paying, and especially when these relationships are strong, those payments become a priority. So I think a cautious approach, a one-at-a-time kind of approach, and giving people breaks between loans without penalty is a really good approach for being able to give people access to these things over time and keeping a client in the long term.
Paul, last question before I sort of open this up to Q&A from our audience. What's your response to that? How does Off-Grid Electric look at risk? How are you assessing it at the point of sale? And are you comfortable that we are setting the standards right in that way?
Sorry, I lost you for a second here.
I'm sorry. So just asking about risk assessment and what Julie's talking about, how are you able to assess somebody's willingness and ability to repay the loan at the point of sale? And how do you sort of monitor that in an ongoing way?
Yeah, that's a very tough one as well. I know that in certain countries it's possible to check a customer or a prospect with a credit screening. In the markets that we are active, it's not. So what we are doing as a credit screening mechanism is a higher upfront fee. Basically, have a higher upfront fee so that the people that engage in the lease are good for the money, are up for it. So that's one thing. We are involved in a range of projects. One of them is with FIBR and MasterCard Foundation on getting more data and insights around not necessarily on how to select the right customers, but more around credit behavior. So maybe to refer to Julie's last comment around allowing people some gaps in between that align a loan with harvest periods, because a lot of our rural clients are farmers, their income is seasonal, and yes, allowing time to those people definitely helps. So those are things that we're looking into at the moment. So how can we do this best? The effect of that, the trickle-down effect of that is that when we start to allow people time in between loans, that means that the loan itself drags on. We have to extend the actual loan period. And yeah, with the current interest rates in the market, you could easily see when you extend the loan with a 1-year term, that the accumulated interest actually accounts for a 30% higher product price. So there's a big trade-off on what is how much flexibility can you give, and how does it weigh up against then the actual price that the customer has to pay, and what is fair, and where's the tipping point. So I think at the moment we as a company are not there yet. We haven't gathered enough data and insights around it. I know that there are various initiatives happening, and this is a hot topic in the sector in general. For us, it's still a very difficult topic that we don't have a clear answer to.
Okay, that's fair enough, I think. So we've received a bunch of questions through the chat. We can still take a few more, so if people still want to submit, we should be able to get them in. Just taking them kind of in the order that we received here. So from Alessandra Tissot, asking, are microfinance schemes available to communities we surveyed, and if yes, were they access for financing access to energy? That wasn't specifically the goal of this research, but Julie, both from this and sort of the other research you've done, maybe Paul as well, is microfinance playing a role in increasing access to energy?
What I will say is microfinance tends to sort of hit these markets in pockets where they can sort of have agents on the ground still to a large extent. So what we did here in places that have quite a lot of microfinance, like Kenya, is that many are offering sort of small-scale solar lanterns rather than systems, so not really on the PAYGo side, but I think that they're interested in the energy space, but are still sort of just dabbling on the edges with really small kinds of things. One exception would be 1 Acre Fund, so they are introducing some kinds of solar systems to clients on an optional basis. So what we did see was really small scale.
Great. Unless Paul has anything to add, I'll move on to the next one there. Again, from Agiles Ored, I really like this question. I think it's an interesting, important one. Does going up market go against the initial vision of this space to provide lighting and energy for the bottom of the pyramid? And to Paul, I'll just add that to you, that you've seen a lot of public money go into this sector from a variety of development finance institutions. And at the end of the day, if that goes towards financing, televisions for lower to middle income households, I think we all recognize the values there for the household. Is that what these people are funding, and do you think that that represents how the sector was I guess, sold, for lack of a better term?
No, I think that's a good comment. I think the initial, when you look at a little bit the history of the sector, it more or less 5 years ago, that's when these PAYGo solar companies emerged, and a lot of the social impact funds, they really went to, or were intended to be for enabling the rural poor with access to electricity. So we changed that, we shifted our approach, and with us also other companies in the space. We do believe, however, that it is beneficial. There is a trickle-down effect. The price of the technology drops. So what a television solar system cost almost twice as much 3 years ago compared to how much it costs now. So our thinking is very much around, we do still believe that we can have a great social impact in also enabling the rural poor with television systems. And and anticipate on that price decrease of the technology, the trickle-down effects. And basically, it also comes down as the more people sign up for this technology, economies of scale matters, both from a production perspective as well from a finance perspective. So the more people get the technology, the more other people are also enabled to get the technology. So the initial, to go back to the initial question is, yes, correct. Initially, the idea was with all of these social enterprises, we focus on the bottom of the pyramid, but the reality is that it's a very difficult, tough market. So we changed our approach there.
Well, I think we've got 650 million people without energy in Africa, and if you can hit even the higher income part of that segment, that's still an amazing job, and we need to work on models that can go lower. But Yasmin, I know you had a comment on this.
Yeah, no, just a reaction. You know, we still speak about that income at a household level, and that's how we've thought about it for decades and decades. And now we're starting to, of course, collect more individualized data. And there was a study recently published on a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa looking at nutrition, and it found that, you know, it's not that people located in poor households are necessarily malnourished. Actually, if you looked at the distribution of this, it's found a lot of women and children in, you know, medium and higher income households were malnourished, whereas women and children in poorer households were, you know, quite well nourished, and it had to do with intra-household bargaining power and dynamics and such. And so even if you're targeting a middle-income household with, you know, light, with access to television and radio, refrigeration, that kind of thing, I think there's an argument to be made that you're still probably reaching a fair number of people who are disadvantaged, because we have to look at the intra-household dynamics here.
Right. The next question, I think, Yasmin, is also going to go to you from Alexander Sotoriu. Are the gender issues that we're talking about more a reflection of the product and the business model, or a reflection of the underlying societal norms? So we hit on this a little bit, but then the real follow-up here, and if it is in fact these are the underlying dynamics and they are what they are, what are the best practices that providers can adopt to, you know, mitigate these effects, I guess, or to increase inclusion for women?
Well, I think it's not an either-or, right? Is it the product or is it the norms? The norms will dictate what kinds of products are appropriate for people. One example that I'll give is that this is a product that CARE piloted in Uganda, and it was a mobile wallet with sub-wallets for the household level, and the sub-wallets would be allocated to the husband or the wife, and they would, you know, discuss the household spending and allocate the funds, and then the sub-wallets could be locked, for example. And so that's an example of a financial service, right, a financial product that takes into account social norms, social dynamics, you know, feedback on the product from customers that they valued this kind of, this opened a lot of conversations for them, opened a lot of doors. It allowed them to make decisions and make spending more discreetly. When things are very public, you know, who's paying for what, then it becomes, oh, why is his wife paying for this? Is he not, you know, man to support his family? All this kind, or, you know, sort of, does she wear the pants in the household? These kinds of dynamics, you know, people really value the privacy that digital affords, and people value the personal control that it affords. And, you know, those, the fact that people place value on that is a function of social norms at play. And so to the extent that you can incorporate that into your product, I think it will go a long way to making that product successful.
Okay. We have a question, Julie, I'll throw this to you, from Max Kleinens. I hope I'm saying that right. What were the types of interactions that customers had with companies which they didn't appreciate? Do we have any examples, sort of referring to the idea of this customer for life and building that relationship that we talked about?
We kind of saw two dynamics. One where people were just treated like any sort of other business, where they felt like the text messages, even that they were getting, were very impersonal, that when they called for help, people weren't listening to the real problem and would just give them sort of scripted responses. And you would be surprised at how little it takes to change that perspective. So, for example, one company, when we asked people, like, okay, when you get messages from them, how do you feel? They're like, they are so nice. They say, dear customer. They use they got the impression that people really cared about them. Another provider has a call center representative assigned to each client. So every time the client gets a call from the provider, it's the same person. And so they just appreciate that the person calls them Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, and things like that. It was really, really simple. Sometimes when they're not treated with respect, they feel like they've been tricked or deceived. And that's a really bad thing that you want people to who are supposed to keep paying you maybe for several years to feel about you. In one case, there was an individual sales rep who was just notoriously rude to people. It wasn't like anything about sort of enforcing aspects of the product that were dislikable. It was just, she was just rude. And people were really, really upset about that. Especially in these rural areas, relationships matter so much to people. Of course, it mattered to me too, even here in the U.S.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're getting to the end of this, and so we've gotten a good question to close on. And Paul, given that you're dialing in from the farthest, I'll go with you for it. We were asked, how would we rate the African PAYGo market? Very successful, successful, or not so successful? And I'll also just add my own question, because I know that Off-Grid Electric has just expanded into new markets and is probably looking at others. Is this the model that's really going to drive energy access for off-grid populations, or is it going to remain, well, is it going to be more of a niche product?
Yeah, let me start by saying I think moderately successful. I think when the sector emerged 5 years ago, the companies, the expectations were high. It was a very euphoric scene. I mean, everything was possible and everything was great and amazing. And I mean, I speak for our company. I know that a lot of companies experience the same. We ran in a lot of roadblocks. I mean, Julie brought up a couple of good examples on sales officers being very rude, call center representatives saying wrong information, customers feeling tricked. Also, we experienced that. And so I think the expectations were set higher, and I think none of the companies really met those expectations. So that's why I would say moderately successful, because still I do believe that companies are becoming more mature. We start to understand our customers better, the market better. We know how to target the market better, and basically the operational mechanisms to treat the customers with respect and honesty are falling in place right now. So I think thus far moderately successful. The future, I think I'm very optimistic about. I see that it's evident that the technology is really coming from this innovator phase to a more of a majority phase. The people know about solar. People can see how it can benefit them. The perception is changing to become more and more increasingly positive. So for the toekomst of solar energy, I think I'm confident, I'm happy, I'm positive. Yeah, just let me end there.
Thank you, Paul. I've spoken quite a bit, so for final thoughts, I'll turn it over to Julie. You've led this research, and I think you have a good sense of what's needed in the future and what we need to learn more about.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see some innovation on logistics. I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but what has really enabled these business models is mobile money and payments over distance, but they're delivering physical products and delivering in remote areas, and that's really, really difficult. And I think some of these high costs that Paul has talked about come in that regard. And so I'm excited to see how people can innovate on those logistics at scale and getting them right, and seeing if there can be some learning from managing agents across PAYGo and mobile money and vice versa to see if we can bring some efficiencies to this kind of a market on the logistics side, which I hope will be just as important, I think will be just as important as getting efficiency on the costs of the technology and on the financing side.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to everybody who called in. The name of the publication, again, is Escaping Darkness. You can find it on CGAP's webpage. And feel free to reach out to myself or any of the panelists with any additional questions. It was a pleasure having this conversation today, and thank you to Yasmin, Paul, and Julie. Look forward to learning more about the sector and seeing where it goes in the future.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.